Welcome back. We want to talk a little bit about what is JavaScript. What is it? It's a programming language, yes, but it is an interpreted language, which means it always runs in another program. JavaScript, for our purposes, runs in a web browser. There are other programs that use JavaScript. A lot of Adobe programs like Photoshop and Acrobat and even ActionScript in Flash is based on the core of JavaScript. So JavaScript is run inside other programs. And some people look at that as a limitation because you can't build a standalone program like Photoshop with JavaScript. You can't write files to disk, um, and people tend to think it's not quite as sophisticated. It's a very sophisticated language. It's an object-oriented language. It has a history of being intended to work with web technologies, and it does it very, very, very well. In fact, they've even taken it from its intended purpose of working with web pages on a client machine, and there are made versions that work on servers. Node.js works on web servers, the back end, and JavaScript was originally intended to just work on front end or browsers or client machines. And that's what we're talking about this term, is JavaScript on a client machine running in a browser, manipulating web pages with behavior and interactivity. Now, the other part of this course is going to be talking about jQuery a little bit. And what is jQuery? It sounds very, very strange as a name. There are common tasks done in almost any programming language, and when there are common tasks, usually people will come up with shortcuts and common solutions to problems they run across. What that collection of solutions is called is a library, and jQuery is a library of commonly needed and used commands for JavaScript. It is built in JavaScript, and it just is a bunch of shortcuts. There are other libraries like MooTools that are either similar or do specific things that are unlike jQuery, and there are just tons and tons of different libraries out there for specific purposes. So jQuery is a friend because it helps you get work done faster and with less hassle. General programming usually follows some conventions. And one of the conventions you can say with programming language is it's a foreign language. It's not something native to you. It's not even native to a computer. It's like this weird intermediary language that is not native to people. It's not native to the computer. Computers use machine code to run, and we use natural languages for us. So we have to have this in-between language, and usually it's a programming language like JavaScript. We're going to start out by learning the grammar and the vocabulary of JavaScript, and you can break it down into, at its simplest, nouns and verbs. Nouns and verbs. And JavaScript, when you look at it, these nouns and verbs, has a lot of similarity to the programming language C. Nobody is expecting you to know anything about this programming language called C. But if you do know something about C or C++ or C Sharp or Objective-C, JavaScript is very, very similar. They didn't go out and reinvent the wheel. It's very, very similar. So if you learn JavaScript, you know a lot about a lot of other languages. Now, one of the things you do in programming is you sit down and you work out your problems, or the solutions to your problems, before you even start coding. A good programmer is a good problem solver. And one of the ways you work out solutions to your problems is just writing things out, trying to figure them out on a piece of paper before you even start typing in any kind of code. This process is called coming up with pseudocode, or kind of like English plain language version of how to solve a problem. Say you want to display a welcome message using the name of a person viewing a web page. There's a process you're going to have to go through and work out to get that done. You first might ask a visitor's name. You might get the response. Then you might take that response and print it out or display it on the screen. And it's just something that simple as a way of working out the steps between how you think and how the computer thinks. By week 3, we'll be doing pseudocode regularly, but for right now, we've got to concentrate on those nouns and verbs. Now, once you know the steps, you're ready to write the program, you're ready to use those nouns and verbs. So let's look at how you would add these pieces of JavaScript to a web page. Now, you've no doubt seen this before. It's the standard XHTML, well, in this case, an HTML 4.01 DTD, and we have a script tag in there. It's a non-empty tag because it has an opening and closing tag. It's a funny little case because there's no content that will display on the page, but it does have code content, so we're going to call it non-empty. Make more sense when we start using it. Now, notice it's in the head of your document, and it just has an opening script and a closing script tag, and all your script will go between it. Another thing that makes life easier is if you use the HTML5 DTD. Notice at the top we're using the HTML5 DTD, and one result of that is it simplifies our DTD, but it also simplifies our script tag. Notice we lost that attribute talking about text equal JavaScript. Very, very nice to simplify things over time. We're still in the head of the document. It's one place of putting your JavaScript is in the head of a document, but there's nothing that says you can't put it at the bottom of your document instead of in the head. This is a technique to make sure all your web page is loaded before you execute your JavaScript. JavaScript, remember, manipulates it, creates behaviors and interactivity to the content of your web page. So if your web page is not loaded, JavaScript doesn't work very well. In fact, it will break if it doesn't find the objects it is pointing to. So this is just one way, one place of making sure that happens. Another way you can link to JavaScript is very similar to how you link to external CSS files. So if you use a link tag, which is an empty tag, to link to an external CSS file as a source attribute, we use the same script attribute for JavaScript to point to an external file, and we use the source attribute as well. So there you can, just like CSS, link to an external JavaScript file. And please note that we're putting all our JavaScript in a JS folder. Keep it all together because you probably will have more than one JavaScript file on most of your web pages as you do anything of any sophistication. Except for the most bare minimum JavaScripts, you'll have more than one. In fact, one of the things you have to keep in mind is you only want to link to one external JavaScript file per script tag. There are ways of loading, say, multiple CSS files with one link tag, but for JavaScript, please don't put more than one link per script tag. Just use a bunch of script tags, otherwise it just won't work. Also note that there was an embedded JavaScript tag as well.